Welcome back, everybody, to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into some really fascinating stuff. We're looking at the relationship between the U.S. and Colombia, specifically during the presidencies of Gustavo Petro and Donald Trump.
Yeah, it was quite a period.
Yeah.
Kind of pressure cooker. Lots of clashing ideologies and economic pressures on both sides.
Yeah, lots to unpack.
Good.
And to help us do that, we've got this great analytical report, really dives into the whole thing, and particularly focuses on how all this drama impacted Petro's approval rating.
Yeah, and it's crucial. I mean, it's crucial to remember that this relationship has a long history. It goes way back.
Yeah.
You think about Plan Colombia, that was the drug war era.
Right.
And then, fast forward, you have the free trade agreement, and they're tying their economies together, which, sets the stage for this kind of clash between Petro and his vision for an independent Colombia, and then Trump and his America First agenda.
Yeah, and Plan Colombia, for those who might need a refresher, Plan Colombia was a massive U.S. initiative, started back in 2000.
Right.
And it poured billions of dollars in aid into Colombia, mostly aimed at fighting drug trafficking. But it also had this side effect of kind of increasing U.S. influence there.
Right, and so Petro's election was really a turning point. You have a leader coming from a leftist background, deeply focused on Colombian sovereignty, and that put him at odds with this more traditional U.S.-Colombia dynamic.
Yeah, and then you layer on top of that the free trade agreement, signed in 2012,
Right.
really cemented these economic ties between the two countries.
Yeah.
Colombian agriculture, manufacturing. In some ways it boomed, but it also sparked this criticism, about this sort of neoliberal agenda, something that Petro has always been against.
Yeah. It created this this complex situation, right? On the one hand, you have this economic interdependence fostered by the free trade agreement, and on the other hand, you have Petro with his vision of a more autonomous Colombia, and navigating that. And then you throw Trump into the mix.
Yeah.
And things really get complicated.
It's like mixing oil and water.
Yeah.
And things escalated quickly, didn't they? I mean, this report, it lays out this crazy timeline, beginning with just these mass deportations of Colombians from the U.S. back in early 2023. Over 15,000 people in just 3 months.
Yeah. And Petro's response was swift.
Yeah.
Basically said, hold on, this is not okay. And, temporarily barred U.S. officials who were involved with those deportations from even entering Colombia.
Whoa.
So talk about a strong message.
Yeah. He viewed it as a human rights violation.
Right.
I mean, imagine the impact on those families.
Absolutely, yeah. And it demonstrated, his willingness to stand up to the U.S., which I'd argue is something we haven't really seen from Colombian leaders in the recent past. Yeah. It wasn't just about the deportations themselves. It was about sending this message about Colombian sovereignty.
Yeah, and it was just the beginning. A few months later, Trump slaps these massive tariffs on key Colombian exports. Coffee, textiles, flowers. These are huge, huge industries for Colombia.
Yeah, we're talking 30% on coffee, 25% on textiles, 20% on flowers. Products that make up a significant, chunk of their GDP, around 12%.
Yeah.
It was a major blow to Petro's efforts to bolster the Colombian economy.
So on one hand, he's trying to lessen Colombia's dependence on the U.S.
Uh-huh.
On the other, you've got Trump, hitting them where it hurts, their economy. Feels like a power play, doesn't it?
It certainly seems that way. And if that wasn't enough, the U.S. revoked visas for several Colombian officials, even including, the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Wow, taking it to another level, that effectively shuts down, direct communication cooperation. What was the reasoning behind that?
Well, the U.S. cited concerns about corruption and security. But a lot of people saw it as a way to pressure Petro's government and, isolate them diplomatically. And you got to remember, this is also, a time when the U.S. was pushing hard against, other leftist governments in the region.
So you have this rapidly escalating situation, a full-blown diplomatic standoff. And then, seemingly out of the blue, Petro changes course, starts accepting more deportees and softens his tone towards the U.S. It feels like a complete 180 from his previous stance. What do you make of that?
Well, it was definitely a surprising turn of events, and there was a lot of pressure coming from the Organization of American States. And the situation at the border was, it was becoming a humanitarian crisis. So Petro ultimately agreed to accept an additional 10,000 deportees. Which was a pragmatic decision, but it also opened him up to quite a bit of criticism.
It's a tough spot to be in. caught between what's right for your people and the political pressures from the international stage. Yeah, it's a classic political dilemma, right? You stick to your ideals
Okay.
even if it means potential hardship, or do you compromise, to try to find a workable solution? And then how do you explain that to your supporters, especially when your whole platform is built on this promise of change?
Exactly. And this report highlights how that dilemma played out in Colombia.
Mm.
Public opinion was split,
Yeah.
especially between urban and rural communities.
So how did urban Colombians, how did they view Petro's shift in strategy?
But polls conducted back in early 2024, they showed that a majority in those urban areas, about 58%, viewed the decision as pragmatic. They saw a need to kind of find some middle ground, especially given all the pressure from these international organizations
Right.
and the humanitarian crisis brewing at the border.
Yeah, I'm guessing that wasn't the sentiment in rural areas.
No, not so much. The same polls showed that a majority in those rural communities, about 62%, felt that Petro was giving in to pressure from the U.S.
Right.
And of course these were the communities that were hit the hardest by those tariffs.
Yeah.
Their livelihoods were really on the line.
So you have this sharp divide in public opinion, and Petra's trying to appeal to these very, very different groups, with very different needs and perspectives. So what was his strategy for navigating that?
Well, he tried to kind of tailor his message to kind of resonate with each group, right? For example, in urban areas, which tend to be more progressive, he really leaned into this concept of energy sovereignty.
Mm-hmm.
Opposing fracking.
Yeah.
And emphasizing investment in renewables,
Yeah.
which really resonated with younger voters, those more environmentally conscious voters.
Right. Appeal to their values and priorities. What about those rural communities? They were more focused on that economic stability. How did he address those concerns?
He focused on providing more direct support to the agricultural sector, promised subsidies and aid to help those farmers weather the storm caused by the tariffs. And he also talked about diversifying Colombia's economy so they wouldn't be so reliant on the U.S. market.
So it's like a classic balancing act. You're trying to kind of appease different segments of the population without alienating anyone completely.
Absolutely. And all of this was happening, against this changing political landscape in Latin America and Petro's stance against the U.S. It resonated with some of those leftist leaders in the region who saw him as a symbol of resistance against what they saw as U.S. imperialism.
But I'm guessing that wasn't a universally popular view.
Yeah, no, you're right. It did cause some friction with some of Colombia's traditional allies who were much more cautious about challenging the U.S. And then you also have the Colombian diaspora in the U.S. caught in the middle of all of this.
Yeah. Yeah, their voices often get lost in these big geopolitical stories. What was their experience like during this time?
It was incredibly difficult. Imagine feeling like you're being pulled in two different directions, caught between your homeland and the country where you've built a life. And data from that time shows that the vast majority of Colombians living in the U.S., they opposed those deportations. They felt abandoned by both governments.
Yeah, it's a reminder that these aren't just abstract political battles. I mean, they have real world consequences for real people.
Exactly. And as if the situation wasn't complicated enough. You also have this rise of fake news and misinformation. It was like an information war happening alongside the political and the economic conflict.
Yeah, the report mentions this fabricated story about Petro, planning to seize American property in Colombia.
Yeah, completely unfounded, but it spread like wildfire on social media. And you also had pro-Petro narratives circulating, exaggerating the success of his trade deals with China, painting them as this perfect alternative to the U.S. It was a constant battle to separate fact from fiction.
So much noise. It makes you wonder how anyone could form an informed opinion.
Yeah, it's a real challenge, and it's one of the reasons this report is so valuable. It cuts through all of that and focuses on the data. And what does that data tell us? Well, Petro's approval rating it took a hit, but it wasn't a simple up or down. It actually flipped depending on where you looked.
Interesting. So what did the numbers look like in urban areas versus rural areas?
Well, in the cities, where people were more likely to see Petro's shift on the deportations as a necessary compromise, his approval rating, it dipped.
Yeah.
But in rural areas, where people felt like he was standing up for them against the U.S. and providing much-needed economic support, his approval rating actually went up.
Wow, so a complete reversal. It seems like the Colombian people were judging him based on very different criteria.
Yeah, and it all kind of culminated in these incredible protests that erupted across the country. In Bogota, you had thousands of people demanding a tougher stance against the U.S. They saw Petro's shift as a betrayal. But at the same time, in the rural areas, you had coffee farmers marching, protesting the losses they were suffering because of the tariffs. It was this incredible visual representation of this divided public opinion.
Like two different countries existing within the same borders.
Let's bring it back to the human level, though. The report mentions a quote from Juan Perez, a Colombian deported from Florida, who said, "Petro gave us hope, but now we feel abandoned."
Heartbreaking. It's a reminder that behind all of the political maneuvering and all the economic data, these are real people whose lives are being deeply affected.
Yeah. So after all this turmoil, where do things stand? What does the future hold for Colombia?
Right.
And its relationship with the U.S.? Does this report offer any insights into that?
It does, yeah. It lays out 3 potential scenarios, calls them optimistic, pessimistic, and the wild card.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's start with that optimistic scenario. What does that look like?
Okay, so in that scenario, Petro successfully diversifies Colombia's markets, reduces their reliance on the U.S. He manages to gain stronger support in rural areas through those agricultural subsidies, and maintains a decent overall approval rating. So essentially, he finds a way to thread the needle, right? Keeps both the urban and the rural populations relatively happy, while lessening their dependence on the U.S. It's a tough ask, but not impossible. Now, what about the pessimistic scenario? What does that one look like?
Well, in that case, the Colombian economy continues to suffer, under the weight of those tariffs. Inconsistencies in those migration policies erode trust in Petro's leadership, and his approval rating plummets.
Right.
You see increased social unrest, and the situation just becomes even more unstable.
The wild card, what throws a wrench into the works?
The 2024 U.S. election. It's the ultimate unknown. If Trump were to win a second term, the tensions, they'd likely escalate even further. But if a Democrat wins, it could open up, possibilities for dialogue and a more cooperative relationship.
So the fate of Colombia, at least in part, rests on the outcome of an election in another country. Talk about feeling like you're at the mercy of forces beyond your control.
It highlights the interconnected nature of global politics, right? What happens in one part of the world has ripple effects elsewhere.
It makes you wonder, what can Petro do in the meantime? He's facing this incredible pressure, both from inside and outside the country. Does this report offer any guidance on that?
It does, yeah. It outlines 3 key areas where the Colombian government can focus their efforts: strategic communication, economic diversification, and proactive diplomacy.
Okay, let's unpack those a bit. What do they mean by strategic communication?
Well, it's about crafting this unified message, right? That highlights Petro's achievements, especially his social programs, without directly antagonizing the U.S. It's a delicate balance.
Right.
You want to assert your sovereignty, stand up for your values, but you also need to maintain some sort of workable relationship with a very powerful neighbor.
It's like walking a tightrope. One wrong step and the whole thing could come crashing down.
Exactly. And then there's economic diversification, which is absolutely crucial for reducing Colombia's dependence on any single market, especially the U.S. And the report points to renewable energy as a potential area for growth. Colombia has incredible potential in that sector, and it could attract investment from European countries, lessening their reliance on the U.S.
So forging those new partnerships, building new bridges, it makes sense. And finally, proactive diplomacy. What does that entail in this context?
Well, it means reaching out to both sides of the political spectrum in the U.S. Building relationships with both Trump advisors and those within the Democratic Party. The goal is to be prepared for any outcome in that 2024 election, and have a plan in place, to engage with whoever wins.
It's about thinking long term, building those relationships that can withstand the ups and downs of electoral cycles.
Precisely. And it's about recognizing that this situation, it's bigger than just Petro and Trump. It's about the well-being of the Colombian people and their future.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the historical context of U.S.-Colombian relations to the political roller coaster of the Petro and Trump years. What's the main takeaway for our listeners? What should they be thinking about as they process all of this information?
I think the main takeaway is that this polarization between Colombia and the U.S. is likely to persist. This clash of ideologies fueled by global economic forces, it's not going to disappear overnight. The future really depends on whether these two countries can find a way to coexist peacefully and productively.
It's a complex situation, with no easy answers. But this deep dive has given us a much clearer understanding of the forces at play, the challenges faced by the Colombian people,
Yeah.
and the potential paths forward.
Absolutely.
And ultimately, it's up to each individual to decide what they believe and how they want to engage with these complex issues. So we encourage you to continue exploring, to seek out diverse perspectives, and to form your own conclusions. Because the more informed we are, the better equipped we are to navigate the complexities of our world.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning.